Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Mondays with Mundy. That's me, Jim Mundy, the historian for the Union League Legacy Foundation at the Union League of Philadelphia, and you all know where that is, I'm sure. So this week's episode is going to deal with more of the human side of the League. We've done a lot of the history stuff lately, but we're going to do something different today. So we're focusing on a League family, the Samuel Stockton White family, specifically. And it's a really fun story with a really, really neat ending to it. So here we go. And while I'm doing that, let me, of course, share my screen so I can show you the PowerPoint. Okay. And if I do it right, okay, I need to do slideshow. Come on. And then from the beginning. Here we go. Did it work? Yes, it did. Hot dogs. Okay. So the episode is called From Enamel to Bronze, Samuel S. White III, the American Athlete. Let's get going. Right, so our tale begins with this gentleman, Samuel S. White. You can see his dates there. In 1844, he created something called the Samuel S. White Dental Manufacturing Company, and it would become the world's largest manufacturer of dental products, especially focusing on enamel products, teeth and dentures. And in the 19th century, that was pretty important, but they made everything in the end. And Samuel White joined the Union League in February of 1863, very early in the League's history, so clearly he was a good Union man. So Samuel White had a large family, including a son, James Clarence White. Unfortunately, I don't have a photograph of him, but J. Clarence White, as he became known, joined the Union League in 1873, 10 years after his father. And James Clarence White also had a family, and he begat Samuel Stockton White III. That is he. Right. You can see, strapping young man, as they would say. So Samuel White III was born in Germantown in 1876, which was a time when in England, Germany, and the United States, there was a movement towards what they called physical culture, because as more and more, as a larger white-collar demographic group evolved, they became afraid of something called the disease of affluence, and that is that these white-collar men weren't getting any exercise, and therefore they would be more subject to physical diseases and things like that. And so bodybuilding specifically became very popular. Gymnastics became popular in high schools, colleges, and gymnasiums. So all throughout Western Europe and the United States. And Samuel White seems to have caught that bug because he attended Germantown Academy, where he was on the gymnastics team and bodybuilding team. And you can see the results. Quite a young man. So young Samuel White, after graduating from Germantown Academy, went to Princeton University, where he also joined the gymnastics team and did the bodybuilding thing and stuff like that. Graduated from Princeton and then went to England, where he enrolled at Cambridge University. And while he was at Cambridge, some friends of his went on a trip to actually two things. First of all, they met a fellow named Eugene Sandow, who created something called the Sandow Academy. And this basically was a school where they taught physical culture. That is, how to take care of your body through physical exercise and gymnastics and bodybuilding and things like that. And young Sam White was so good at it that in 1899, just a year after joining this academy, he won the Sandow Medal, which basically said that young Mr. White was considered to have the best physical appearance of any male in all of Great Britain, which is pretty amazing. So after that, shortly afterwards, actually 2 years afterwards, young Sam and some friends of his were in Paris, where they met or heard about a French sculptor named Auguste Rodin. And Rodin at this point is probably the most well-known, popular, and acclaimed French sculptor in the world. His specialty was creating bronzes that produced a sense of naturalism that promoted the physicality and the character of the subjects. And this, in a sense, led into what we think of as the modern version or the modern tradition of sculpture today. So Auguste Rodin was always looking for models, as you can imagine. Sculptors do that, as do artists. And White was introduced to Rodin, went to visit Rodin at his studio, and Rodin simply asked young Mr. White to walk around the studio a few times to see, well, it kind of sounds like what Thomas Eakins was doing in Philadelphia in a lot of ways. So eventually young Sam White just said, look, why don't I just sit down and see what happens? And that's what he did. And he sat down, put his hands on his legs, and Rodin said, that's it. And this is what created. Actually, first off, here we have Auguste Rodin. That is he on the left, painted by John Singer Sargent in 1884, because John Singer Sargent painted everybody in Western Europe and the United States in the 19th century. And that is Rodin on the right-hand side, a photograph of him, probably as White would have known him in the early 20th century. Okay, so what did Rodin do with young Mr. White? This is the sculpture that Auguste Rodin created in 1901, and he called The Athlete. All right, so again, White sat down, put his hands on his legs, and Rodin did the rest. And boy, you can just, again, talk about that sense of naturalism coming through, the character and the physicality of young Mr. White is certainly in these bronzes. I mean, just look at that. And just look at the way he's looking at us. I mean, it's like, yeah, he knows who he is, doesn't he? So good stuff there. A few years later, actually 3 years later, Rodin would produce a second version where young Mr. White is looking off to the right. Now in 1903, young Mr. White came back to Philadelphia. He joined the Samuel S. White dental manufacturer. Eventually in 1926, he would become a director at the same time. Now, this sculpture became so popular in Western Europe that in 1907, an Italian sculptor named Rembrandt Bugatti, whose brother, by the way, created the Bugatti auto manufacturing company, created this sculpture of Samuel White, but it was meant to be a funeral or a grave monument and marker at a Parisian landscape cemetery called Père Lachaise, which was opened in 1806. So White apparently became very popular. Now, White, in 1915, would go on a trip to California. He met a young lady named Vera McIntyre, who was an artist in her own right. She was primarily a watercolorist, but did oils as well. They would get married, come back to Philadelphia, and they would spend the rest of their lives there. So now young Mr. White would, like his father and grandfather before him, join the Union League of Philadelphia. So he's the third generation White to join the league. And this is young Mr. White turned into old Mr. White at his desk at the White Dental Company, which then was at 1130 Chestnut Street in Philadelphia. Okay. And this is Samuel White. I mean, you can imagine what kind of a personality he must have had to begin with, as we saw as a young man, and now to see him but look at that smile, that it's so infectious. But you can just see that muscular young man in an older man himself. So really must have been quite a character. So he and his wife were very involved in the art world in Philadelphia. They were art collectors, as you can imagine. And Mr. White was one of the early members of the board of directors at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, which opened in 1928. His wife was named an administrator, so they were intricately involved in the running of the art museum until each of them died, respectively, Sam White in 1952 and Vera White in 1966. And after Mrs. White died, she donated their art collection to the museum, which you can still see to this day. Now, where can you see this bronze sculpture of a Union League member that was done by Auguste Rodin? I mean, geez, isn't that great? Right here. And this is the Rodin Museum on the Parkway in Philadelphia, which is now run by the Philadelphia Museum of Art. Famous thinker done by Rodin in 1888 out front. You go through that gate, and behind you can see the building where the museum actually is itself. It's my understanding that the Rodin Museum in Philadelphia is the only one that has a copy of each of the two versions of the Athlete, which has become known over the years as the American Athlete at the same time. There was also a copy of the first version, the 1901, at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, which in theory is available in Gallery 265, but double check the website for that. So interesting story. And who would have thought that the Union League of Philadelphia would have a member who would be the subject of an Auguste Rodin bronze that you can see in all the major museums around the world. So go take a look. Seriously, once the museums open up again, it really is worth it. And the Rodin Museum is a jewel among museums in Philadelphia itself. So we have some other interesting dental members of the league, so maybe sometime we'll talk about them in the future. But in the meantime, until next week's episode, thank you for watching this one. I thank you on behalf of the Union League Legacy Foundation. And in the week that passes by, I hope everyone will stay safe, stay well. We'll see you in a week's time. So thanks very much and goodbye.